Welcome to the Reel Rematch, the podcast where we unpack Hollywood's twin films, sometimes cloned on purpose, sometimes by accident, but always in competition. Today's matchup, Snow White Smackdown. Mirror Mirror versus Snow White and the Huntsman. Two live-action reimaginings of the classic fairy tale released just months apart. One leans into colourful fantasy and playful satire, the other swings for dark epic spectacle and mythic scale. Which version enchanted audiences more? Which one brought sharper magic to the mirror? And which film ultimately reigns as the fairest of them all?
So, Jeff, how are you?
Good, mate. Good, Justin. How are you going?
I'm well. Strangely, looking forward to this more than I thought when, we looked at it on paper in planning for the episode.
Yeah, right. Okay. All right.
So, remind everyone, Jeff, what are we reviewing today?
Well, today we're going into fairy tales, specifically one, which is Snow White. So we're going to talk about two Snow Whites that came out in the same year, being Mirror Mirror and Snow White and the Huntsman. So I'm not sure if, I know there's many fairy tale films, but what's your thoughts just on that?
You know, it's interesting. I think, let's start off the pod doing a bit of a deep dive into this, because we always like to ask ourselves, why same topic, same year, are these films being made time and time again?
Yes.
And I asked myself the question, how many fairy tale or fairy tale inspired films actually came out in this decade? Because it was probably bigger than just Mirror Mirror and Snow White and the Huntsman.
Sure.
Was my theory.
Yep.
So I tested that theory.
Okay.
Now, happy to publish the full list that I came up with, and people can debate, inclusions, exclusions, or otherwise. I have tried to stay quite pure. So anything that's mythic or fantasy-led, not, strict, following fairy tale sort of principles or heavily inspired by, I excluded. So where I landed was, in the decade of the 2010s, there were 29 films that were fairy tale or fairy tale inspired.
What? Sorry, 29?
29.
That's a lot.
And it was a lot. So 2.9 a year.
Right.
Right? So I went back, because why not, another 3 decades and said, what about the other decades?
All right.
So surprisingly, the preceding decade, the 2000s, there were 28 films that were fairy tale or fairy tale inspired.
Right.
So that's 2.8 a year. So only one more in the 2010s. But still, today, that has been peak decade for fairy tale or fairy tale inspired movies.
Yeah.
Let's go back to the 90s. 18 films, 1.8 a year.
Okay.
Right? I blame independent cinema. Right? Now, what did surprise me, because when I started going back in history, I thought, surely the 80s.
Yeah.
It was all about escapist and fantasy fare, and cocaine fueled the majority of boardroom, decisions in Hollywood, right?
Yeah.
And there were a lot. And if you would probably include fantasy, maybe there's a whole heap more. So 22 films in that decade, right? So 2.2 a year. So what is amazing is the 2010s, at least over the last 4 decades, has been the peak decade for fairy tale inspired movies.
Yeah, it's very interesting, isn't it? Because it's like, there was, when you say that and you start thinking about why there is, there will be things that you remember from that decade, your Alice in Wonderland, your Maleficents, those kind of things. So yeah, there must have been a lot from inspiration. So
I've got a couple of things that I wrote down in terms of, why did this seem to happen? And the short answer is, it wasn't just one event. It was a culmination, almost kind of like an audience, readiness, where they were getting pump primed over the course of decades.
Yeah.
For this to hit and hit really large in a pretty sustained manner for, the last 2 decades, right? So I have this a little bit about at a sequence, but the big landmark that really happened almost turn of the century, 21st century, was Shrek, right? Okay. It was a cultural and commercial phenomenon.
Yes, it was.
I mean, it was an Oscar winner as well,
Yes, that's true.
right? It pretty much reinvented, fairy tales as meta comedy. Like, I mean, it seems so simple and straightforward, and there'd always been, even in the Disney films, some adult-laced content, so you can have a quiet smile while you're watching the film with nieces and nephews, sons, daughters, whatever the case may happen to be.
Yeah.
But Shrek, as you know, turned the volume up to 15, right, and just ran with it, and they really proved in no uncertain terms that fairy tales could target adults as well as kids.
Okay.
And really sort of like serve up something, for everyone, right? So I think Shrek, certainly didn't invent that concept, but validated it in a really outsized manner, right? And I think the flexibility from an IP perspective for fairy tales, like how they can both be, whimsical, but dark, they can be satirical, they can be romantic, they can just be epic in scope, or they can be a combination of all these things.
Yeah.
Really lends itself to really, that 4-quadrant broad church of entertainment.
Yes.
That Hollywood does seem to go for, for G or PG sort of like rated films, right? Again, like, this film again validated, fairy tale storytelling from children's fantasy to 4-quadrant blockbuster. I mean, that's really kind of, I think, what Shrek proved.
Yeah.
Now, if we rewind another decade, Shrek wouldn't have existed if the Disney Renaissance, right?
Yes.
Which is broadly the reimagining of some of their classic films that occurred between 1989 and 1999. So that's when they reeled off The Little Mermaid, Beauty and the Beast, Aladdin, Lion King, and Mulan.
Yeah.
And we spoke about this, obviously, when we were doing Fishy Business, Finding Nemo versus Shark Tale. And obviously, Mr. Katzenberg, played a large role, obviously, in stewarding the success of those films. I mean, that really revived the global appetite for fairy tale-like storytelling, right? Because again, all of those films hit really, really huge.
They were blockbusters.
And then what Disney did off the back of that success, and obviously, home video market had transitioned from VHS to DVD, and it was kind of going crazy early 2000s, right? Is that they thought, we don't have to do these tentpole feature films anymore. We just go direct to video. And why not just keep mining the classics that proved to be a huge success for us in the previous decade? So they came out with, direct to video sequels like Little Mermaid 2. They then did, sort of CGI remakes in Cinderella, Beauty and the Beast. They did return to fairy tale musicals with like Princess and the Frog. So, there was a whole heap of, recontextualizing and reimagining off the back of, Disney really reintroducing, decades old classics to modern audiences.
Yeah.
Now, the other thing that really started to hit, and I know that you've got a bit on this, so I don't want to step on some of your stuff, is in the 2000s, this whole concept of IP mining really started to ratchet up. Before it was let's get a book.
Yeah.
Let's adapt a Broadway play.
Yeah.
Things like that. Then all of a sudden it became, let's get a newspaper article. Like, let's go to comic books. Let's do this. And
blog posts.
The commercialization of Hollywood, like there's always more in show business. What do they say, Jeff? There's like 90% business, 10% show, or whatever the ratio
Something
is.
like that, yes.
But what really happened is that as budgets kept escalating, and the commercialization kept growing, invariably risk tolerance starts to go down. So people want to have closer to a sure thing.
Yeah.
Right. So why not get something globally recognizable, 4-quadrant, structurally pretty simple. And IP's free.
Yeah.
Because these fairy tales are in the public domain.
Absolutely.
What is it, 50 years that they have to?
70, 75, I think.
Is that what it is?
Yeah.
Right? So the price is right.
Yeah.
So, let's then jump into, something else that I think had quite a large impact as to, why the last 2 decades or the 2010s, there were so many of these fairy tale films. It's technology. So, the fact that there was like this huge tech breakthrough in terms of CGI and visual effects, and obviously hence all the Marvel movies and otherwise, is, fairy tales require like magical creatures, enchanted forests, mythical landscapes, transformations from a goblin to a pony or whatever, right?
Yes.
Like, and then, the advent of, other huge blockbuster films, some of which are kind of like in this cohort, some of which are not, more sort of in the fantasy realm, like your Lord of the Rings, like your Harry Potter, right? Is that, and the outside success that they had, studios just thought, like, we can use those same digital tools to make all these fairy tales that are more kind of kid-friendly, make them look epic, and paint them on a larger canvas.
Yes.
And give them a much larger scope than they've ever had or ever been realised before, right? And that opened the door to, obviously, two of the films we're about to discuss today.
Yeah.
Probably Snow White and the Huntsman more than Mirror Mirror because it's a bit more epic in scale.
Absolutely,
But, really at a high level in summation of the technology component, the 80s had the ambition but primitive tech. The 90s had ideas but inconsistent VFX. 2000s finally had both. Right.
Well, following on from you and going from 2000 to just in tech things, like you said, you start with Lord of the Rings, where epic fantasy becomes, visually amazing and appealing, done in a fantastic way, and again, Academy Award-winning way. And then you go Avatar in 2009, which again just changed the landscape because Cameron's been pushing the envelope since the 80s, and here he is again doing in 2009. So these kind of four-quadrant stories you talk about suddenly become, as you said, larger and more epic because they've got the ability with this CGI factor to go to spaces that they never could have done previously. So
the other thing that I mean, like you're 100% correct. I mean, like the other thing I thought is that, again, we talked about the pump priming of audiences that Disney. I mean, I'll ask you. I mean, I speculated, but I couldn't tell you because there was already such a huge inbuilt audience for these three franchises that came out in the 2000s, being Harry Potter, Lord of the Rings, and The Chronicles of Narnia.
Yep.
Right? Huge inbuilt audiences and otherwise, but did that again sort of pump prime audiences to be accepting or willing or embracing of other content that maybe they would have seen as, air quotes, too kiddie?
Yeah, because I think, as you said, going into the 2010s, you've had a lot of those young adult features going on, which again have become mythical and brought those audiences back and, like you said, primed them. But then on top of that, you got your Twilight franchise, which again we'll talk about because it does cross over unintentionally with what we're going to talk about later. You got the Hunger Games, which is very, very, takes that mythological to the next step as well. Like you said, Percy Jackson, another big one like that. So all of those created, like, again, mythological attraction to these kind of IP things. It done in a different way, but then made the audiences ready and prepped for going back to these fairy tales that are just, as you said, public domain IP and easy to access.
And tell me, just before I go on to the other moment, was the unofficial working title, at least from Rupert Sanders' perspective, for Snow White and the Huntsman, The Hunger Games?
Okay.
I had to just yell it for the room at some stage.
Yeah, we will get to that. I'm 100% sure both of us have crossed that line.
Hashtag thirst trap.
Yeah.
The only other thing that I thought of, and I want you to pressure test this for me, so I don't know if I'm just like starting to draw anything I can, is was there really so much escapist fare in the first 2 decades of this century because of, what was going on, right? Like, I mean, literally, maybe there was solace in escapism because there was 9/11.
Yep.
Right. There was, the GFC.
Yep.
Right. And, a lot of the socio-political and economic sort of foundations started to unravel somewhat, throughout those 2 decades. Right. We've seen that only accelerate now. So it'll be interesting to see what happens in the 2020s and beyond. But,
yes.
Again, so let's think about this. You had like, and like, the re-entry into obviously, Iraq as well as Afghanistan
But
as a
then the
result.
expansion and worldwide spread of terrorism.
Yeah. So, I mean, like, did these things need some form of antidote? Because, I mean, you had a whole heap of like really interesting kind of, war-related films, The Hurt Locker and Zero Dark 30 and other films like, Jarhead and a whole heap of other films that were made around
Yes.
the subject of war. I mean, again, the antithesis to that is to delve into the realm of fantasy and have an escape.
Oh, because fantasy and mythology is definitely an escapism, right? Going back to ancient times when mythology was there to tell a tale. It wasn't just a fable, but it was there to do a lesson. But obviously, it was an escapist form of doing that. So yeah, I would suggest yes, because it was a turbulent 2 decades, and it's still continuing. Let's be honest. But yeah, so people need this escapism, right? Again, we're looking into this. I mean, we didn't even talk about the 2020s, and we haven't really looked into that. But even you look at the advent of streaming and the amount of content that's required to keep up, right? And just, I mean, if we were to look into that, we'd probably break our minds because of the volume of stuff we could find in regards to that. But I think the escapism thing, yeah, absolutely. And again, children always like escapism because it's just part of who they are. But like you said, particularly in the 2010s as well, because you could go into more of that adult humour, not humour, adult humour, but also adult darker themes and things, bits and pieces, and realise that this kind of story could be told in that manner, then that was a good way to get adults involved and get them into the cinemas to see these pictures. I mean, both those 2 films we're going to talk about did pretty good at the box office, so they've obviously got people off their seats and into the movie theatre. But again, probably just to escape and see what's, get away from their worries and their woes.
No, I think, yeah, there's certainly something there, and it would be fascinating to your earlier remark to look at what has happened 2020 to now. But that's for another day. So, Jeff, we've got to set the scene as to like, how do we get there, and really kind of like some of the cultural forces that were, really the strong undercurrent to sort of, build up to the 2010s, which then became the crest of the wave, right?
Yes.
So can you do a bit of a double click as to like why was the crest of the wave or peak fairy tale the 2010s?
Well, it started off with the success of Alice in Wonderland in 2010s. Tim Burton's Alice in Wonderland, told in his amazing visual style that he did, was $1 billion success, right? Generated a sequel, but off the back of that actually greenlit those different kind of fairy tales. So like your Snow White and the Huntsman that we'll talk about, the Maleficents, the live-action Cinderellas, and even the live-action Disney movies, because they went into brand consolidation. They've got this enormous library of IP, which is fairy tale related, but told in their manner. So you look at the mid-2010s onwards, where you've got your Cinderellas, your Beauty and the Beasts, your Aladdin's remade live-action ones, the Jungle Book that was done in that way, still sort of a fairy tale story in that sense. So, Disney set the tone, everyone else kind of followed from there. But again, the studios were realising that, like you said before, public domain IP equals 0 licensing costs. So we take a story that's well known, we take a story that is a 4-quadrant expected hit, and we can take it from there. We've got name recognition, built-in story beats, we've got archetypes, we've got global familiarity. So it's not just because a lot of the beats in these stories are, yes, told from a certain point of view, but culturally those stories are told across the world, right? And they still have the same kind of heroes and villains and fairy tale iconography that's there, whether you tell it from a Western point of view or not. Like China was massive on these films as well. So, and like we said, the young adult stuff had been building through the 2010s, going from, Harry Potter into Twilight into Hunger Games and those things. So every single audience was involved, from your parents through to your teenagers, through to your, tweens, down to your kids, and so this was Hollywood's way probably of looking for non-superhero things, Marvel. We know that the 2010s was also the decade of Marvel. So starting in 2008 with Iron Man and obviously peaking with the Endgame. But so the studios needed other options. How do we compete with that? Fairy tales. It was a good, easy one to do. So, yeah. But also there was, they could take it to adult fare, which I think is a bit more Snow White and the Huntsman than, say, Mirror Mirror, which we could talk about. Technology was unleashed to tell these stories in an epic tale. And it just, took a nostalgia boom maybe from all those things that some of us who are a bit older had from those, like you said, the 80s and the 90s as well. We're seeing them in new ways. We can introduce our children to them in new ways. And that's probably the reason why. So, yeah.
I mean, it was interesting, right? Because at the time, watching things like use Labyrinth as an example, is that it was more culty, right? Where you fast forward to, and I'm not saying it was a global smash. It did exceptionally well, good business with Snow White and the Huntsman. Audience were just, they were so used to that, and it was just like commercial fare, right? But going back into these worlds and exploring these worlds in the way that we were presented the opportunity, especially in the 80s, like they weren't mainstream, like and there's a host of films. I mean, like Ridley Scott's Legend, right? Like. Dark Crystal, I mean, these weren't huge commercial successes at the time. Became, amazing outsized home video successes over the journey and grew in stature year on year. Since then. But I think it's a great point and a point well made, especially around, the IP. Like what tools did other studios actually have who didn't have the rights to comic book films? Right. And where you want to, make a film that has the largest outsized impact, let's start, mining these stories that have been told for, decades.
Yeah, exactly right. Which I guess if we're going, that's what leads us to where we are today. So
look, why don't we hit the pause button there? I think we can do even a triple click down in terms of why these two specific movies, really about the Snow White fairy tale in the same year. But let's reserve that to later. So, Jeff, run the numbers for us, please, sir.
All right. So, again, 2 films coming out in 2012, same topic. So, as always, we'll look through the numbers. So, Mirror Mirror was first, came out at the end of March 2012, March 30th, 2012. Snow White was not that long afterwards, released only 2 months later, June 1st, 2012. So, one of those films that we see that are close together. We don't have a lot of them. Sometimes there's a year apart. This one's very, very close. They both did really well at the box office and returned about the same for each studio. So Mirror Mirror opened wide on 3,600 screens, took 18.1 million in its opening weekend, and ended up with about a $65 million domestic run. Internationally did a lot better than that, still took another 108.7. So it ended up with $173.6 million in a worldwide take. Again, this was in the DVD age, so it also took an additional 30 million in DVD home video sales. So again, not a bad result.
Solid.
Yeah. So this had a smaller budget, only 85 million. So it took home 2 times the budget for the studio. So not factoring in marketing costs, probably an okay result.
Yeah.
Snow White and the Huntsman in June was a much larger budget and much more lavish affair, as it said, and we'll talk about. Also went wide, opening on 3,700 screens. Its opening weekend was a blockbuster, number 1, 56.2 million opening weekend.
Wow.
Closed out its domestic run with a really solid 155 million. Worldwide was even better. It took another 245 million around the globe, which when I read this was like, I didn't realise it had taken this number. So it closed out worldwide with an impressive $401 million. So not bad result at all. However, it did have a much larger budget of 170 million. So it only returned a slightly better 2.4 times for the studio. But again, DVD age took another 56 million in DVD sales. So
wow.
All in all, both of these films did very well, considering. So I think everyone was happy.
So, so thanks for that, Jeff. I think what's really interesting now is, jumping into the directors, right? Because you have 2 directors that are coming from, obviously non-drama background,
Yeah, they were
initially.
both very successful music video and commercials directors.
Commercial directors. I mean, it looks like from the research, Tarsem Singh, who directed Mirror Mirror, was probably more, feted as an amazing music video director, right? And obviously won a lot of awards for REM's "Losing My Religion." More recently, did Lady Gaga's 911. Did some really big video, commercials for Pepsi and the otherwise. But it sounds like, if I was interpreting the data correctly, that Rupert Sanders was really seen as the go-to commercial guy.
Yes.
Right? He had some award-winning campaign for Halo 3 ODST's The Life campaign in 2009.
Yep.
And also did other commercials for Nike, Adidas, Xbox, Apple, Smirnoff, Guinness, Axe, which is the brand of deodorant, Lynx, as we know it in Australia.
Yep.
That's what they use in the States. Honda as well. So he did some massive brands and was really fed. But I thought that was really interesting. I mean, if we focus on Mirror Mirror first, right? So Tarsem Singh, right? 2012. He obviously had done some previous commercials. I actually remember seeing his debut feature, which was The Cell.
I remember seeing The Cell as well with J-Lo.
Came out, and Vincent D'Onofrio.
Yes.
Came out in 2000, and then a bit of a pause, obviously, at least from a feature film perspective. He did The Fall in 2006.
Yep.
Which I looked into. It was actually based on a script by Dan Gilroy.
Oh, really?
So, yeah, one of the Gilroy boys. So, he followed this by Immortals in 2011.
Yep.
And then he did this in 2012. And then Selfless in 2015, which had Ryan Reynolds playing a young version of Ben Kingsley.
How does that work?
Yeah, exactly. You know what? Colour me surprised. I've not seen that film, and yeah, it's not really scratching any interest to see that film either.
It does.
His next feature after that was a film called Dear Jassie, which I think was more of a sort of Bollywood-style Indian film or otherwise.
Okay.
That came out in 2023, so not super prolific, at least from a feature film perspective. And I want to talk about the visual style a little bit in a moment as a study in contrast with Rupert Sanders.
Yep.
Let's go to Rupert Sanders. This was his debut feature.
Which is, yeah, and obviously, like you say, he's very well known for commercial directors. He's obviously done some amazingly huge campaigns, which have obviously been very successful and no doubt award-winning. But then to give him $170 million for a debut feature is pretty huge.
It's massive, and I'm not going to step on fun facts or trivia because I know that you have some research on that and how we got there. Something that I did find is what was really interesting about him is that at one point in his career he was under the tutelage of Tony Kaye, director of American History X.
Yes.
Right, and also celebrated a kind of classic artist. So I remember he did a campaign for Absolute, which is absolute cirrhosis of the liver. Right? Guess who's not been getting too much more commercial work? Mr. K.
Yeah.
But yeah, so was obviously acknowledged. This is Rupert Sanders as an outsized talent by a lot of different people. A lot of people really wanted to help him realize his potential because obviously he's a visual storyteller. He's really has some serious chops. And I've got to say, look, budget aside, because obviously Snow White the Huntsman had double the budget as Mirror Mirror, right?
Yeah.
But more money doesn't mean better.
I agree.
Now, but however, when I was watching this, is that I look at Mirror Mirror, and there were certain shots that were excellent, really good shots, right? Well done. But there were sequences in Snow White the Huntsman and the staging and how it all came together that were just first class in Snow White the Huntsman. Yeah. Right? And that's the difference. Yeah. Right? Kind of good to great. And the virtual, I guess the visual virtuosity, I should say, I was trying to glue those two words together, by Rupert Sanders, I think far exceeds the ability of Tarsem Singh. And that's not trying to step on, the talent or otherwise that Tarsem Singh has. But like, Rupert Sanders, yeah, I mean, he really is a visualist. Started off as a graphic designer, right? And I think, this person knows the power and knows the how of, visual storytelling.
Yeah.
Right.
Yep.
So I found that really interesting. But let's think about, we'll go rewind to Rupert Sanders and his career. So after this huge success that he had in 2012, he did Ghost in the Shell, which was a live action remake in 2017. I thought that was a heap of shit.
I agree with you. It's a heap of shit.
I mean, I loved obviously the Japanese anime.
Oh, the original animes
that came out in the 90s.
Classic.
I thought it was, bar none, probably, top 5.
Yep.
Well, obviously bar a few, but no, it was top 5.
Yeah.
In terms of like, Japanese animated films that I've ever seen.
Yeah.
And then he does the remake of The Crow in 2024. So 30 years after the beloved, at least from my perspective, Richard, you know how much I love Alex Croy as The Crow.
Yes.
I was one of the many people who didn't want to see that movie remade. I was also one of the few people who was really looking forward to The Crow 2, directed by your ex-boss, Mr. Tim Pope, also a music video director.
Yes.
Right?
Yep.
And was sufficiently, enthused by Hole's cover of Gold Dust Woman, and seeing the video clip, and was seduced and sucked in by how good that trailer was, using that music as the backing, and been so let down to the cinema seeing Crow 2. So the thought of someone else stepping on the legacy of Brandon Lee and how excellent Alex Proyas' film was as Lightning in a Bottle didn't excite me. So I have not seen Rupert Sanders' version of The Crow, and it sounds like neither did pretty much anyone else. And those who did see it thought it was a steaming pile.
Yes, and I agree with that. So it feels to me like he's ridden this wave, this peak. We talk about peak filmmaking. It's like he's been there, done that, and then gone downwards ever since.
And look, I hope he recaptures the magic again, because clearly he's got talent to burn. And we've seen many great, actors, which is both, male and female, and then directors, and I mean, they all have their time in the sun. And some of them are able to, have at these stage these amazing comebacks.
Yeah.
Right. So, and some of them are not. Right. I hope he's able to kind of like capture some of that magic again, because he's got talent, and I'd love to see him given another canvas and be able to execute in the way that he was able to execute, I think, to a certain degree.
Yeah.
With his film. Should we do cast?
Sure, let's do cast.
What I thought was really interesting, Jeff, is these two films, and we'll do the triple click. Is that it almost felt like they were trying to one up each other. Like, because the casting is almost like, who could release the bigger cast? I mean, like, straight off the bat, you build a movie around Julia Roberts, which is what Mirror Mirror did.
Yeah. And
I don't think anyone else has had as much fun as her playing against type, in the last sort of like 20 years. I know we could probably think about it and kind of get a list, but she's loving every minute of this.
Oh, totally. And I have to say, it's not that I had an issue with it. It was that I had to overcome the fact that Julia was the villain. Do you know what I mean? Because she never, as you said, she's playing against type, and she never plays a villain, right? This is all prior to this, okay? Yep. So, yeah, I almost had an issue with it, because it's like, I just couldn't get my head around it originally when I first got there. But like you said, she's loving every minute of it. She totally takes every scene and owns it, because
100%.
And she's clearly had an absolute ball making this film.
And it's interesting, right? So let's think about where she is in her career, because she's in an interesting phase of her career. She came off a huge hit in Eat, Pray, Love in 2010. She does Larry Crown in 2011 with Tom Hanks, which is kind of like, middle of the road. Did okay.
Yep.
She does August Osage County in 2013 with Meryl Streep. And again, that was kind of like middle of the road. It went okay. So an interesting time of her career. Like, I think clearly had peaked, sort of like in the 90s, obviously with Erin Brockovich and winning the Oscar. But is still pumping out some pretty interesting things and still has a huge bankability and commercial appeal for pretty much any project that she's involved in.
It's almost like this is her decade where she starts. I've done my studio run. I've become Julia Roberts, inverted commas, the name. This is her period of I can pick and choose whatever the hell I want.
Absolutely.
You know?
Yeah, there's something in that, like, I've done enough for them, now I'm doing something for me.
Absolutely, yeah, 100%.
Now, going down the rest of the cast, Lily Collins is also in this, and probably best known as Emily in Paris TV series that's on Netflix. Mind you, she was the daughter in Sandra Bullock's family in The Blind Side, which came out in 2009. So obviously 3 years prior to this film.
Yep.
She was also in Priest with Paul Bettany, Carl Urban, and Maggie Q in 2011. She does this in 2012. And then she leads Mortal Instruments, City of Bones in 2013, which was, pretty much right in the middle of the young adult fantasy novel adaptation boom that you mentioned earlier. And then we have the troublesome Armie Hammer.
Armie Hammer.
Now, first name aside, that's not the only reason he's obviously troubled.
Yes.
We're not going to litigate that here today, right? But I think this is peak Armie Hammer.
I got to say, I love him in this film. He's
great.
He's fantastic in this. He's very funny. He has some of the most awkward and weird scenes to do, and he just absorbs them all and does it. He is hilarious in this film.
Well, it's like they're literally asking him to kind of eat feces.
Yeah.
He's got a big shit-eating grin, and he's saying, "Please, sir, can I have some more?"
Absolutely.
Right? Yeah. And I agree. And you know what? If he does get another chance in a meaningful way, I hope he does some more comedies. Because he's got chops.
Yeah, absolutely.
But this is peak Armie Hammer, right? Because he stars as the Winklevi in The Social Network in 2010.
Yep.
Has a small role in J. Edgar in 2011. He does this in 2010. And box office performance aside, it was a pretty big deal back in 2013 to be co-starring alongside Johnny Depp in a remake of The Lone Ranger.
And he was the Lone Ranger.
Right? So that was kind of like peak Armie. So let's go down the cast. The other person who really jumped out at me was Nathan Lane. I thought he was sensational. I loved watching every minute of him. He's obviously best known for probably for his Broadway productions, right? Especially that of The Producers and the subsequent movie adaptation in 2005. But, memorably, he was also in The Birdcage with Robin Williams in 1996. You've got an appearance of Mare Winningham. She's only in a small role, but she was obviously Wendy in St. Elmo's Fire. Came out in 85, and I'll always remember her in that. Michael Lerner, again, he's been in like small but memorable roles. So straight off the bat, pardon the pun, 8 Men Out. See what I did there, Jeff?
Yes.
1988, Barton Fink, a movie that we both love, came out in 91. No Escape, a.k.a. Escape from Absalom, one of my favourite 90s action films with the late, great Ray Liotta. Also has a small role in Elf in 2003. And then, interestingly, you've got Sean Bean, right, who had just finished Game of Thrones Season 1. He's in this as well. So, pretty stacked cast.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
So, I'm going to jump over to Snow White and the Huntsman.
Yep.
Right? So, talking about stacked cast. Oh, my goodness, Jeff. So, we've got Kristen Stewart.
Yep.
She does Twilight in 2008, Adventureland, and Twilight New Moon in 2009, Twilight Eclipse in 2010, Twilight Breaking Dawn Part 1 in 2011, this and Twilight Breaking Dawn Part 2 in 2012. Holy hell, the Twilight saga of movies alone made over US $3 billion at the box office.
Yeah, she was the queen of teen movie stars at that time.
And if she wasn't enough, then you've got Thor himself, Chris Hemsworth. He does Thor and Cabin in the Woods in 2011, The Avengers, this and the remake of Red Dawn in 2012, followed by Rush and Thor The Dark World in 2013. I mean, you'd almost argue that this was like peak Hemsworth.
Yeah.
Right? Because, again, he's cresting right about now.
Yep.
Charlize Theron, So she co-stars with Will Smith in Hancock in 2008. She had a small role in a film that we reviewed a few episodes ago in The Road with Viggo Mortensen.
Yep.
Then she does this and Prometheus in 2012. She follows up in 2014 in A Million Ways to Die in the West, and then does Mad Max Fury Road in 2015. Right?
It's a pretty good run.
I mean, I think that I think that cast in terms of key cast is better than the key cast for Mirror Mirror.
Yep.
But here's where it goes up to 11 or 15, depending on how hyperbolic you want to be. But even if we were just to focus on the other actors, which is effectively the Seven Dwarfs.
Yes.
Okay, so they were all fantastic British character actors. This is a who's who, Jeff.
Oh, totally.
You've got Ian McShane.
Yep.
Boom. You've got Bob Hoskins.
Yes.
Boom. Ray Winstone.
Yes.
Boom. Nick Frost. Boom.
Yeah.
Eddie Marsan, got to be honest, I had to look him up, but again, like one of these super solid British character actors,
Been in everything you've ever seen.
Been in everything you've ever seen. An IMDb as long as the day.
Yep.
I mean, just incredible. Toby Jones,
yes,
another great actor, and Johnny Harris, who I also had to look up, but please see our notes on Eddie Marsan.
Yep.
And then the only one who wasn't really renowned or noted was Brian Gleeson, who's actually Irish.
Yep.
So not British character actor, but he's actually the son of Brendan Gleeson.
So he's the other son. So there's Domhnall Gleeson, he was a very well-known actor. This is the other Gleeson son.
Yeah.
There you go.
So holy hell, what an embarrassment of riches from both casts. But again, in terms of the arms race, maybe money spoke or money talked in this case, right?
Well, we can
having
see
double the budget.
Yeah, when you've got double the budget, you can put the who's who of British theatre/TV/cinema into your film as a dwarf.
So, I mean, it sounds like there was a bit of a foot race to get the movie released in about, 2 months that separated the release of these two films.
Mm.
There was an arms race in the budget, and there was an arms race as to, who would have, the most, respected, venerated, or illustrious cast, right?
Yeah.
It looks like Snow White and the Huntsman.
Can I tell you some, looking at casting alternatives and how it rolls into this, which you may have already researched?
Hit me up.
So, Lily Collins.
Yep.
Auditioned for the role of Snow White in Snow White and the Huntsman and didn't get it.
Yeah.
Sam Claflin auditioned for the role of the Prince in Mirror Mirror and didn't get it and got the role of the Prince in Snow White and the Huntsman.
Right.
But there's so many people who were casting around this. Saoirse Ronan was considered for the role of Snow White in Mirror Mirror, but they decided that at the time the age difference between her and Armie Hammer was too great.
Right.
Felicity Jones was offered the role and turned it down in this one, and then before Lily got it. For Snow White and the Huntsman, there were a lot of this. So at the time, the producers wanted to go with a lesser-known Snow White because they were building the cast out elsewhere. So they looked at Riley Keough, Felicity Jones, Bella Heathcote, Rebecca Maxwell, and Lily Collins first.
Wow.
Then they amped it up a bit because Dakota Fanning and Kirsten Stewart became the two main people circling the role before Stewart got it. So Dakota Fanning was also in line. Winona Ryder was first considered for the Queen before Charlize.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
She would have been good.
Yeah. And for the role of the Huntsman, Tom Hardy was offered the role first. He turned it down.
He would have been great.
Michael Fassbender next.
He would have been good.
Johnny Depp.
No.
Then Viggo Mortensen actually went into negotiations.
Yes, he would have been great.
There was even talk, but it's never fully been approved, that our man Hugh Jackman was offered the role.
Yeah, no.
And then it went to another Aussie, Mr. Chris Hemsworth.
Interesting.
So there was a lot of...
Wow.
But again, like you said, with the budget and the visual fare and whatever this was on the table, this obviously attracted a lot of people towards it.
That's incredible. So, Jeff, we usually do this. We don't always consistently do it, but we usually do it a bit later. Let's do it now off the back of what you've just said. If you were to flip
Yes.
the roles of the Queen, Julia Roberts versus Charlize Theron, who does it better?
Oh. See, Charlize, I could do the comedy because she's done comedy films. Could she ham it as much as Julia did? Probably, but maybe not to the extent. I don't know if she'd give the way Julia did in this. So, yes, but could Julia do what Charlize did? I don't know. She never plays to that level of evil.
Agreed. I mean, I think that's a great shout. I've got nothing to add.
So,
let's then look at Snow White, right? Could Lily Collins have done Kristen Stewart's role and vice versa?
I'd say yes, because she obviously auditioned for it, and I reckon she could, and she's done quite a bunch of various stuff. Could Kristen Stewart? Has she done comedy? Not much. I mean, other than the semi-comedic Charlie's Angels thing she did several years back, she hasn't really played that level of. But it's not even comical. Like, it's not meant to be humorous. Like, but you know what I mean. It wasn't. It was a lot lighter fare and a lot more. It was a lot more comical and humorous. I don't know.
So my thoughts are Kristen Stewart could have done Mirror Mirror.
Yeah.
I don't think she would have been as good as Lily Collins.
Mm-hmm.
And Lily Collins could have done Snow White and the Huntsman, but she wouldn't have been as good as Kristen Stewart in that role. So I think they both landed where they needed to.
Yeah.
Where I fall down on Lily Collins is, and this is where Kristen Stewart probably came into her own, is when her character, spoiler alert, bloody turns into Joan of Arc, right?
Yeah.
When she turns into Joan of Arc, Kristen Stewart, like, she comes into her own, right? I'd love to see Lily Collins try and do that. I don't have memories of her.
Yeah, maybe we've never seen her do that before.
But when Kristen Stewart go, oh yeah, I get it.
Yeah.
I get that, right? So that would be the only remark I'd have on that.
Yeah.
Right? Okay. So, you know, Prince and otherwise, I don't think it's worth litigating.
They're the two main roles. But yeah, so I think, yes, there are ways we could swap it. They would be entirely different performances.
So now, a category that is near and dear to our hearts, Jeff. Mirror, Mirror, Jeff. Did you find an Aussie connection?
No, I didn't, but I'm sure you did.
No.
Oh, you did it?
I'm sorry. I did not. Now, did you find, Jeff, an Aussie connection in Snow White the Huntsman?
Well, you know what? I struggled at the beginning.
Yeah.
But then Chris Hemsworth spoke in a really bad Scottish accent.
Yeah.
And then I went, it probably would be worse if he was in his natural Aussie accent. So
now, did you find anyone else?
Oh, why do I think it was the cinematographer?
Because it was, Jeff.
Cool. There you go.
So, great catch. Greg Fraser.
Greg Fraser, that's it, yes.
So actually a Melbourne lad, right? Now, Jeff, this is what else he's lensed. Rogue One, right? June, parts 1 and 2, Zero Dark 30, and the most recent, The Batman.
Wow.
I mean, like, that is some serious CV just there.
It is.
So that's the lenser for Snow White and the Huntsman, our proud Melburnian.
Yep. There you go.
Greg Fraser.
I did think thank you for reminding me, but I remember looking at it going, it's Greg Fraser, he's an Aussie. I know he is. Yeah.
So, real life inspiration, obviously. The Brothers Grimm fairy tale, Snow White. Apparently first published, Jeff, even though it'd been around for, you know, obviously orally and otherwise, in 1812.
So definitely well out of IP range. Yep.
Now, let's jump into a section. Do you want to do triple click in terms of why these two films specifically, and spend a little bit of time on that?
Well, interestingly, we always look at were they aware of each other, were they made knowledgeable of each other, and again, which seems to be a little bit more common than not. Couldn't really find anything that said they were, right? So Mirror Mirror was first announced in late 2010, began production in early 2011, and obviously shot through 2011 and actually came out early 2012. So not a bad turnaround. I'm going to assume was actually probably planned before then, but was formally announced at that point. It's a bit more interesting on Snow White and the Huntsman. So Evan Doherty, who was credited as one of the writers and the main screenwriter, actually wrote this in 2003 when he was studying at NYU at the time. But even he said, he's quoted as saying, no, because grim, gritty fairy tales hadn't been done at that point, right? So obviously Lord of the Rings had come out, maybe that's what led him to do it. But he said no one knew what to do with it at the time, right? Then Terry Gilliam's The Brothers Grimm film came out in 2005, was a massive flop. And so even though he'd sold the script, it was shelved.
Oh.
Right? But then, thanks to the success of one Mr. Tim Burton's Alice in Wonderland in 2010 and a fractured different version of a fairy tale, suddenly all of a sudden this became a red-hot script, and that's what led to this being pulled back off the shelf, and he resold it and again went into production in 2010. So again, not really competing with each other. This one's been around for a lot of years. It's just, as I said, part of the zeitgeist, part of where it was. It just fell into the right place, right time.
So the only thing I got to add, Jeff, is that I think at the start it was a coincidence, right? Both films were just in early development before either studio had publicly revealed their projects.
Yep.
They just jumped onto the same fairy tale at the same time. It was one of those. I mean, that happens.
Yep.
Right. However, once each studio, which is about mid-2010, knew that the other was making a Snow White movie, it became a full-blown competition.
Yeah. Okay.
It was a race. Right. So we spoke about the outcasting and the one-upmanship and otherwise. We spoke about the budget. And, there was, a lot of maneuvering, with, Universal moving their release dates specifically to block relativity, right? So they shifted the Huntsman release earlier to beat Mirror Mirror to market. And they tried to position their Darker Snow White as the definitive version, right? And then Relativity then moved Mirror Mirror early again, right? So it was a timing war versus copying or otherwise. And it wasn't just in and of itself zeitgeist. It was all the mentions that we mentioned, how we arrived at this point where it was the peak decade for fairy tale or fairy tale inspired movies.
Yep.
So, Jeff, one of our favourite sections that we like to leave to last, like marrow in the bone, trivia and fun facts.
Well, as we discussed at the beginning, I think we need to address the elephant in the room here. Snow White and the Huntsman is probably better known for its controversies just as well as it is for what film it was. So two main controversies here. The primary one being that Kristen Stewart had an affair with the director Rupert Sanders during production. This is when she was also peak Bella Twilight. So that was very controversial, although I did see an article somewhere that said they always claimed they never had an affair. They just kissed once or twice, but then stopped it at that point. Either way, it caused a massive worldwide controversy, particularly because at the time her partner was then this bloke, Robert Pattinson. I think we've heard of him. He played some bloke in some film. So there was there's obviously imagery of him literally leaving their shared house in LA somewhere and going out from there. The second one was that Rupert's wife left the production halfway through. Now, her name was Liberty Ross, and she was actually Snow White's mother at the beginning of the film.
Oh, really?
Yeah. So, and then for the second half of the film, she started divorce proceedings.
So the interesting takeaway I take from that is there was a moment in time where Rupert Sanders was the brother-in-law to Atticus Ross, one half of the dual Oscar-winning composer team with Trent Reznor, and obviously a member of Nine Inch Nails.
Really?
I mean, wow, right?
That's pretty amazing.
Can you imagine family get-togethers, barbecues or otherwise?
I'd love to be a fly at that Christmas table.
Not just that as well. It'd be like, if you think you had any modicum of musical taste or talent or otherwise, just don't.
Yeah.
Just, Atticus and Trent in the room.
Yeah.
Let them cook.
Yeah.
Or you know what? If they don't want to cook, let them have silence.
That's it. Just don't get involved.
Yeah.
The other main controversy about this film is the fact that their decision to use famous actors to play the dwarves instead of actual dwarves themselves, which is what Mirror Mirror did, and using the digital technology to replace the faces. We spoke about who these famous guys were who played the Seven Dwarves, but they copped a massive amount of flack for that decision. Most famously from Wicket the Ewok himself, Warwick Davis.
I prefer Willow, Jeff.
Oh, okay. Most famously from Willow himself, Warwick Davis, who called the decision inexcusable, given the fact that there were many short actors out there who could more than fulfil these roles. The call also came out from the Little People of America at the time it was released to basically boycott the film because they didn't use actual characters with dwarfism to play the dwarves. So,
I get it. Like, there wouldn't be an abundance of roles available for those in the community. So, is that right?
Yeah.
So
now also, what else did I find with regards to this? So this is Kristen Stewart had to actually relearn to ride a horse for Snow White and the Huntsman. She apparently was quite a big rider when she was a very young girl until she had an accident when she was 9. I think she broke her elbow or something and then stopped riding and had actually a kind of fear of horses at that point. So she had to overcome that fear to learn to ride one again. This is also the final film of Bob Hoskins. So this is the last film he did. He retired after this. He'd actually been diagnosed with Parkinson's already prior to this point. So He died out. He actually passed away a couple of years later in 2014. So,
okay.
And the only other point I had on this one was the character of Ravenna, Charlize's character, is actually based on the legend of Ursabet, or Elizabeth Bathory, who was a 17th century Hungarian potentate who allegedly consumed and bathed in the blood of murdered young girls in an attempt to rejuvenate herself. So,
how about that?
That's where that came from.
But I've got to ask, what is a potentate?
I don't know. Can I come back to you next time we do this?
Please.
Sure.
Because that sounds a great word for Scrabble.
Did you have anything else about Snow White and the Huntsman?
Surprisingly, I've got a bit.
Okay.
So if we rewind to say this was Rupert Sanders' directorial debut and, how did he impress them and otherwise, apparently he was actually the only Helmer considered by the production team. The day after being contacted by the studio, Sanders had assembled some mood boards, which he presented them to give an idea of how he wanted the film to look. He was then given a week to put together some shots. He put together like a 3-minute clip. When Universal saw what he had achieved like this, they greenlit the film immediately.
There you go.
So, again, just hit it out of the park with his vision, visual storytelling capability and obviously technical prowess, and showed them that what he was doing in small form, by way of length and TV commercials, he could scale to, feature length, and obviously used the toe in the water 3-minute as a kind of as the audition for that, really.
Yeah.
He was quite exacting in a few different ways. He had an insistence on realism in scale, particularly. So he wanted minimal miniature model work and the huge castle that was actually in the Enchanted Forest, for an example, it took 6 months
to build.
Right? The giant trebuchet, or like sort of
slingshot,
or catapult, whatever you want to refer to it as, that consisted of a metal skeleton interior and a wooden exterior. It weighed 6.5 tons. Right? Let's go further down as to how exacting he was. The throne room took 3 months to build, right? So I thought, that was interesting. Not just that. Do you remember the drops of blood at the beginning of the film, Jeff?
When
the 3 drops.
Yeah, the mother first. Yeah.
Yeah. So that was real blood from director Rupert Sanders. The guy's a psycho. So he felt the fake blood looked too unrealistic, so he pricked his own finger to get the shot that he wanted. That's commitment.
It's a commitment to your art, isn't it?
100%. And you know what? Well, I admire that. Yep. Credit where it's due. So The other number of things that I have is, again, this is interesting, is that the inspiration for the throne room that I just mentioned was actually Durham Cathedral in the north of England. So the production designer, Dominic Watkins, he travelled the length and the breadth of England and visited many cathedrals in the country for inspiration, and that was one of the key ones.
There you go.
Now, I referenced this a little bit earlier, right, in terms of Kristen Stewart. So very specifically, when her character Snow White rallies the troops before the final battle, the scene borrows iconic images from both sides of England and France's wars in the early 15th century. Her words paraphrase what English King Henry V allegedly said to rally his troops for battle at, is it Agincourt?
Yes, it's Agincourt.
In 1415, as speculated by William Shakespeare. Her appearance is based on the French commander Saint Jean d'Arc, or Joan of Arc, as we know.
Yep.
Who turned the tide during the period of 1429 to 1431. So, again, I felt Kristen Stewart I did that passage of film probably in a way that only she could have done. So the other really interesting thing when we talk about, fairy tales and fairy tale inspiration and otherwise, so I've got another something for you. Okay. Joe Roth, he was the producer.
Yes.
He was clearly tickled pink with fairy tales and really captured his imagination in a way that few other things would have done. Now, Jeff, he did 6 fairy tale inspired movies in 9 years. He does this in 2012. He does Oz the Great and Powerful in 2013, directed by one of our guys, Sam Raimi.
Yep.
He does Maleficent in 2014, starring Angelina Jolie. He does the follow-up to Snow White and the Huntsman, called The Huntsman, Winter's War in 2016, which was sans Kristen Stewart. I wonder why, but it still had Hemsworth and Theron. He does another follow-up in 2016 for Alice Through the Looking Glass with the same key cast as the first. So if we had gone back to 2009, he would have done like 7 fairy tale inspired movies in a decade.
Yeah.
And it had the same key cast as the first, and he does another follow-up to Maleficent in Maleficent, Mistress of Evil in 2019 with the same key cast. So, again, there was, inspiration upon inspiration in, the fairy tale realm.
Yeah.
That certainly influenced many things, including...
Well, going back to what you just briefly said there, this is the reason, Kristen Stewart was not asked to come back for the sequel because this made a lot of money. There was going to be talk of a sequel. They didn't bring her back because of, or Rupert Sanders, because of their affair. And
can I be as bold? I haven't done any research to back this up as well, but in all fairness, Kristen Stewart is not really a name I see, either above the credits or just below key cast role with any frequency, like I did if you rewind, 10 plus years ago.
Yeah.
I know that she's been in things since. I haven't seen her in a whole heap, right? Did this derail her career?
Possibly for a while, and I think then, if you were, and not one of our things to do, if you were to deep dive post Twilight for these two, Robert Pattinson and Kristen Stewart, and this is just anecdotally, see that they've never really kept going with the blockbuster route, right? They've chosen small indie fare to go through until Pattinson opted to put on the cowl, become Batman.
Yeah.
But other than that, you don't really see him in a lot of big ticket stuff. So.
And you know who you don't see at all? Taylor Lautner.
Other than in the odd Taylor Swift video, but yes.
Yeah.
Yeah. So, cool.
So, what about Mirror Mirror?
Mirror Mirror. So there's a little bit of interesting stuff on this one, and I'll finish hopefully with a very humorous one you might find funny. But let's see what else I've got. So Julia Roberts' dresses were so large in this film and her kids were so, she used to hide her kids under them during takes.
That's outstanding. So
they'd literally hide under there while they were recording. But they were also so big and heavy that one time when she was talking to Nathan Lane's character, she turned and literally tore a muscle because the things were so heavy. And the quote goes, Nathan Lane asked her if she was all right. She said, "I think I've ripped something." So there you go.
How about that?
This is Tarsem Singh's only film that's not rated R.
Oh,
that he's done. All the rest are rated R. So Selfless, Immortals, The Cell, all rated R. This is his only non-rated R film. For the longest time, this film was known as the Untitled Snow White Project because they couldn't decide on a title for it.
Okay.
The studio ended up picking the title Mirror Mirror.
Right.
Tarsem wanted to call it just Snow.
Oh.
So that was his option.
Okay.
Now, so tying things together, Julia Roberts has been in another fairy tale inspired film.
Hook.
Yes.
1991.
That's
Steven
right.
Spielberg.
In that film, she worked with a gentleman who I think was Smee, a certain Mr. Phil Collins, who happens to be the father of a certain Lily Collins. So,
of course.
So she's worked with...
I completely forgot Phil Collins was in that.
Yeah. Yeah. Once I read that, I was like, yes, that's right, because he plays... I think he's Smee in it, isn't he?
I can feel that.
Yeah. So
bad dad jokes.
Yeah. Now, Julia, again, talking about Tarsem, Julia apparently, when she was first sent to film, absolutely hated it. She thought, this will never work. I don't want to do it. I'll hate it.
Right.
Until she went and met with Tarsem Singh.
Okay.
So when she met him and came out afterwards, she was like, she signed on the next day.
Oh, wow.
So.
Mr. Charm.
Yeah. I've got 3 other things to mention. So there's the scene where she's getting ready for her wedding and they do go put her through all these semi-tortuous beauty treatments.
Mm-hmm.
Now, all of those beauty therapies were based on fact. They're all actual beauty therapies that they picked all the weirdest ones they could find from around the world, including bird poo paste facials.
Oh, wow. And
everything like that. The only one that wasn't real was the bee sting pollen on your face, on your lips.
Isn't that incredible?
So,
the lengths that we go to, Jeff, is a right.
Yes, that's right.
Stay eternally youthful.
So my couple of things. The tiara that Snow White wears at the end.
Right.
It's an antique Van Cleef & Arpels tiara that belonged to Grace Kelly.
Oh, really?
Yes.
How about that?
It has 144 diamonds in it that total 77.34 carats, set in a platinum and white gold structure. Its value is quoted as priceless.
Priceless.
They can't put a value on it.
Okay.
And I'll leave this one. This is my last one. In this film, in European Portuguese, is titled "Mirror, Mirror, Mirror, Is There Anyone Hotter Than Me?"
Oh, nice.
So, if you're European Portuguese, that's what the film is known as.
I like that because it's kind of like a sneak peek into the mind of, right? So,
yeah. You know what? You could have called both of those films. Could have had that topic.
Correct. Correct. Oh, that's excellent. Look, I've only got a couple. I mean, that's a great rundown. I've only got a few things to add. So, Iko Ishioka,
the designer,
costume designer.
Yes.
She was nominated for an Oscar for Best Achievement in Costume Design at the 2013 Academy Awards, posthumously because she passed away. So this is the last film of hers before she passed.
Okay.
And she had collaborated with Tarsem Singh on every one of his feature films. I didn't do deeper research to see if she was involved in music videos or the commercials that he did, but certainly every feature film that he did. So the 2 other items that I have, I've actually got 3, sorry, is Martin Kleber previously portrayed one of Snow White's 7 dwarfs in Snow White, the Fairest of Them All in 2001, which is a TV movie.
Right.
He played Friday, right? But then he obviously was in this film, and then he played a dwarf again in Snow White, the Fairest of Them All. In Snow White, in 2025. That was the most recent one.
Yeah.
And he played the dwarf Grumpy.
Okay.
So, typecast.
There you go.
Right? He goes, look, you're really good just as one of the Snow White's
dwarfs. Yeah.
You know what I mean?
Yeah.
He goes, but I've got dramatic
range.
chops. I've got range. Give me a comedy.
Yeah.
So there was a sign outside the dwarves' house that read, "No entry over 4 feet." At least 4 of the dwarves were over 4 feet, including Butcher, who has the line,
I say never trust anyone over 4 feet.
he's 4'1".
So he's a hypocrite, is what you're saying?
100%.
Okay.
100%. Now, the other item that I have is the peacocks painted on the wall in the Queen's Room are direct copies of the ones painted by James Abbott McNeill Whistler in his famous Peacock Room that he did in 1876 to 77. And the glass tables were designed by famous Art Nouveau jeweller and artist René Lalique.
There you go.
So it was interesting in terms of the production design and the attention to detail and where they sought inspiration and otherwise.
It's evident across this entire film.
It really is. I think they did a great job on all the production design and the costumes in this film. And I actually prefer the costume design and the production design in this. As I said, the cinematography and the action and the editing and everything else, Snow White and the Huntsman, 100%.
Yeah.
But yeah, credit where it's due.
Cool.
So I don't have anything else, Jeff. So we've come to the end of it. So who won the rematch?
Who's the fairest of them all?
Who's the fairest of them all?
I don't know. I've got a soft spot for Mirror Mirror. I'm going to say Mirror Mirror.
I'm going to go the other way. I'm going to go the Huntsman. I mean, and I say that like as wonderfully sort of like, you know, campy and colourful, and how joyous Julia Roberts looks playing that role and just being an absolute, you know, hero or heroine is the ham and just loving every moment of it. Yeah, for my sensibilities, you know, just give me sort of like loud crash bang and
bit of action.
And a bit of action.
Some sword fights.
Yeah. So and as I said, I just thought just the staging and some of the scenes and set pieces I thought were probably next level vis-a-vis sort of like Mirror Mirror. You know, I got to say I didn't love the Bollywood kind of ending to Mirror Mirror.
No, that's the only thing that I don't like.
That, you know, that but that's a personal preference.
Yeah, no,
right?
I don't like. I'm not a big fan of that either. It's just.
It didn't actually seem in keeping with the film either.
No, that's
if I'm honest. It felt shoehorned in, and I get that.
It's like, did he have to? Was he contracted to make a commercial music video for someone, and he decided to use his budget here to tack it on somewhere?
Well, it's almost like, hey, Tarsem, we need an extra 3 minutes, man.
Yeah.
Any ideas?
Yeah.
He goes, I got it. So, Jeff, that's been an absolute pleasure.
Always, my friend.
What have you got coming up next episode?
Well, let's keep it lighthearted. I think we're going to go animation again. We haven't done some in a while. So we're going to look at 2 animated penguin films that came out around the same time. Happy Feet and Surf's Up.
Looking forward to it, Jeff.
All right, mate. We'll see you then.